Hey folks, James here. I would like to start off this video by congratulating everyone who entered last month's sew along. All of your designs turned out so wonderful, and I concluded that we really do have the most talented customers. And yes, it is already time to start our next Sweet Pea sew along. For the month of May, we are all making the Mirrored Floral Quilt. The quilt comes in 5 different sizes: 4x4, 5x5, 6x6, 7x7 and the 8x8 hoops. There are 4 blocks included with this design. The great thing about this quilt is there are so many possible finer layouts you can get by using different combinations of blocks. I'll show you some examples now. As you can see, it's totally up to your own creativity and preference. In this video tutorial, I will show you the stitch out of block 1 and the construction of the quilt. Remember, this is just an example of what the quilt could look like, but we really encourage you to make it your own. It is also recommended that in conjunction with the video, you follow our photograph written instructions when completing the quilt. In the instructions, you will also find the different layouts you can make with each of the blocks. Before we start, please give this video a like, and if you haven't already, go over to our YouTube channel and press subscribe. Thank you. Go ahead and load the design onto your machine. Hoop up some cutaway stabilizer and let's get started by placing batting 1 on top of the hoop and stitch down. Use your fingers or the pink thing from Sweet Pea Essentials to keep the batting from getting bunched up under the needle. With applique scissors, trim back the batting 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitch down line. Careful not to cut into the stitching. Once completely trimmed, stitch the placement line for the background. Next, place fabric A right side up on top of the hoop, covering the placement line, and stitch down. Use your pink thang to keep the fabric taut. This will help the quality of the finished block. Now remove the hoop from your machine and trim the fabric about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching. Leave the excess fabric in the seams. Once trimmed, embroider the quilting on the background. Now we are going to start on the applique. Use the diagram provided on the written instructions to follow which piece of applique is next in the sequence. The number corresponds to the step number in the file. Stitch the placement line for fabric B, which will be pieces 5 on the diagram. Place both pieces on top of the placement lines and stitch down. Trim the fabric 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching and remember to leave the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the satin stitch around the pieces of applique. Repeat the applique process with piece 8 using pieces of fabric large enough to cover the placement lines. Trim the fabric, leaving the excess in the seams. Embroider the satin stitch around the pieces. Embroider the vine sections. Repeat the applique process with piece 12, using pieces of fabric large enough to cover the placement line. Trim the fabric, leaving the excess in the seams. Embroider the satin stitch around the pieces. Repeat the applique process with pieces 15, using fabric C. Trim the fabric, embroider the satin stitch around the piece. Embroider the vine sections. Repeat the applique process with piece 19, using fabric D. Trim the fabric. Embroider the satin stitch around the piece. Repeat the applique process with pieces 22, using pieces of fabric large enough to cover the placement lines. Trim the fabric. Embroider the satin stitch around the pieces. embroider the leaves at the bottom of the flower. Repeat the exact same applique and embroidery process for pieces 26, 29 and 32. Refer to diagram on instructions. The stitch out of block 1 is now complete. Well done. Now take your work out of the hoop and trim the seams of your block to about ½ inch. Let us now start on the construction of the quilt. The first step is joining the blocks together. Lay out your blocks on a flat surface and decide on your layout. Refer to the written instructions for examples of other layouts you can do using the 4 different blocks. Start off by deciding which way will be the easiest to join your blocks. We have chosen to join a section of 4 blocks at a time, and then continue to attach these together later. This will make it easier to line up the satin stitches. Take the first 2 blocks and place them right sides together. Pin along one edge, lining up the border stitching the best you can. Take your time with this process. Take the pinned blocks over to your sewing machine and stitch the side seam. Stitch just inside the border already stitched on the blocks, so the stitching will not be seen on the right sides later. Make sure you guide the block as you go, lining up all the satin stitches. Then iron open the seams. Continue the same process with the second row of this section. Now continue to sew these 2 rows together by placing them right sides together and pinning along the bottom edge. Stitch just inside the border already stitched on the blocks, so the stitching will not be seen on the right sides later. Make sure you guide the rows as you go, lining up all the satin stitches. Open out the stitched seams and iron flat. This will give you a completed section. Continue this process with the remaining sections of your quilt. You should have each flower joined together before continuing. Now that you have finished connecting each flower, we are going to sew each section together. Once you have joined all the sections together, iron open all the seams. The second step of construction is attaching the flat piping. This step is optional. Measure the joined blocks, allowing for 1 inch overlapping each side of the blocks, and cut your fabric. Cut 2 1.5 inch strips for the flat piping on the sides. Note, the flat piping strips should not have any joins in them, as this will cause them to look uneven when finished. Press the strips of flat fabric for the binding in half widthways, ensuring the raw edges are sitting exactly on top of each other. Lay a flat piping strip on top of the bottom edge of the right side of the joined blocks with the folded edge, pointing towards the center of the background fabric. Pin or quilt clip together and stitch into place with a 1/4 inch seam. Repeat for the other long edge of your quilt. The edges of flat piping will overlap the ends. Now trim. Repeat process for the remaining short ends using fabric eye. Now trim. The next step will be adding the backing onto your quilt. Place your backing fabric wrong side up and place the quilt on top of the backing, wrong sides together. Pin the outside of the quilt to the backing so both are secured for the stitch and the ditch process. We also use some spray adhesive to secure the two together. To join the backing, stitch in the ditch along the block seams or free motion the quilt. Then edge baste all of the edges around the quilt, sandwiching all layers using a 1/4 inch seam with a long stitch. This just helps keep everything in place when attaching the binding. Once this is done, trim the excess backing fabric so it matches the exact same shape of the quilt. The final step is adding the binding to your quilt. Feel free to use your own preferred way of adding the binding to the outer edges of your runner or follow our method of making binding. To make the binding, measure the length and width of the quilt and add them together and then multiply by 2. Cut a long strip of fabric this length. If you're cutting one piece of fabric this length, add about an extra 12 to 16 inches to the length, just to be sure you have enough fabric in the end. Or cut a few strips and join them together with your sewing machine as shown. Add extra length if you're joining strips, about 4 inches per strip. The width is optional, but we usually find 3 inches wide sufficient. To join the strips, lay the ends of your fabric strips right sides together as shown and draw a 45-degree angle and sew a diagonal seam from corner to corner. And then cut a 1/4 inch from the stitch down. Then iron the seam open and repeat until all the binding strips are sewn together into one long strip. Once you have joined the strips together, fold the whole strip in half, wrong sides together and iron down. Lay out your binding fabric and unfold one end. Fold that open end of the binding to a 45-degree angle as shown and lightly press. Trim your fabric a 1/4 inch from the 45-degree angle fold. Fold the binding strip in half again as shown. Match the raw edges of your quilt and the binding to the desired starting location with your quilt wrong side up. Start about halfway along one side. Using a measuring tape, mark 1 inch down from the end of the strip. Mark with a pin. Using a measuring tape, mark 3 inches down from the 1 inch mark. Mark with a second pin. At this time, we also marked a 2-inch gap above the first pin. This pin will signal when to stop stitching once you have sewn around the quilt. Using a 3/8 of an inch seam, stitch 1 inch of the open fold onto the quilt and stop stitching when you get to the 1 inch mark. Then leave a 3-inch gap. This will provide an opening to insert the end of the binding fabric when we have completed the sewing. Then start stitching again at that 3-inch mark. Continue sewing until you reach the first corner and stop stitching 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the end, but keep your needle down. Lift your foot and turn your quilt with your needle still down. Continue stitching to the corner. Lift the binding strip over and pull against that angled stitch that we have just made to form a diagonal fold. Then fold the binding strip down, creating a fold at the top. Pin and start stitching again until you reach the side of the quilt that you started on, mitering the corners as you go. Stop stitching when you get to the pin that marks the 2 inches from the starting point. Fold up the remaining binding so it sits just above the first 3-inch mark. Trim the excess binding, leaving enough to slip into the fold. Trim 2 to 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch off the raw edge of the binding for a good 1 inch. Place the end of the binding fabric into the pocket created at the start of the binding process. Pin in place. Continue to stitch the seam until the binding is completely sewn on. Fold back the binding and iron the seams flat. Now turn your quilt over so you're working on the front. We started at the corners of the quilt. Fold in one side of the corner just past the stitching and iron well. Repeat for the other side of the corner, meeting up with the first fold, creating a nice pointed corner. Clip into place. Then continue folding and pinning the remaining binding to the front of the quilt, just past the stitching. Repeat for all 4 corners of the quilt. Start stitching anywhere on the quilt from the front and top stitch. You will have visible lines on the front, so we used invisible thread. You could also color match if you would like. When you get to the corner, simply just leave your needle down, lift the foot and rotate the quilt. Then put your foot down and continue stitching in this fashion until you are right around the quilt. To finish off, give your quilt a good press. Well done! You have now finished your mirrored floral quilt. Enjoy! Thanks for watching Sweet Pea's video tutorial on making the mirrored floral quilt. We are dying to see all your finished quilts, so remember to join our Sew Along group on Facebook and post all your wonderful photos once you have completed the quilt. This was another video from James. Good luck and I hope to see you again next month. Happy crafting everyone. Like, comment and subscribe.